DevelopSec, developing security awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hi, and welcome to episode 17 of the DevelopSec podcast. I am your host, James Jardine, and today we're going to talk about authorization. Now, remember that authorization is the process that's going to take place after we do authentication. And it has to happen after we do authentication because we can't determine what you're able to do, and that's the process of authorization, right? Is determining what a known entity can or cannot do within the system. We have to authenticate to know who that identity is. How do I know that you are who you claim to be? And that's where that authentication piece comes in. Because remember that the difference between authentication and authorization, which often gets confused, is authentication is just determining, are you the identity that you say you are? Whether that's through a username and password, whether that's through biometrics, whatever the case may be, the purpose there is, this is who I am. Okay, we verified that. Now within our system, we start performing authorization checks of what are you authorized to do within that system, whether that be accessing administrative screens, if you're a read-only user, whether you can write to any, make any changes like an edit screen. Those type of things are all authorization issues, and we have to be very cautious of that because people are out there attempting to bypass the authorization that's set up. And we see some pretty bad schemes of doing authorization. So we want to talk a little bit about how we can think about authorization and maybe some different ways that we can implement it a little bit better, or maybe think about places that we're not implementing authorization, but we need to. So, as I mentioned, the goal behind authorization is to determine, does this user have access to the resource that they're trying to access? So, on a regular file system, right, do I have access to a file, or is that only given access to John in the cubicle next to me, right? That's his file, I can't access that. In a web application, do I have access to the administrative interface? Do I have access to edit users or just view them, right? Think of an application that shows you your user directory. Now, if I'm just a normal user, I might be able to search the user directory and look at each user and see some details, and maybe not all details, but I can see some details, but I can't edit those details, right? Only the user of that actual user gets to edit the details that are on there, or maybe an administrator has the edit capability to update somebody's information. That choice is made when we set up the rules of what role has access to what. So then once we identify you, we know what role you fall in, we know whether you're allowed to access that data. One place that's common that we overlook it is looking at just individual records within a database. Say I'm going to view my credit card statement online, and we happen to have, my user ID sits in the URL. Not a good idea, but maybe that's where it is. And we've seen examples of this in the past where the account ID or some identifier like that was just in the URL. And okay, I go up, I ask for my record, which is record number 5. The system goes up, takes that number 5, goes to the database, pulls that record, and displays it down to the screen. A key point there that we didn't mention as we walked through that real brief scenario is that there has to be an authorization check to say, hey, this is user James. Does he have access to record 5? Oh, yes, he does. Now I can pull it down. Because if we miss that record level authorization check, then what if I change that 5 to a 6, which is somebody else's account? Well, if I don't do any authorization check, the same pattern exists. The request for number 6 goes up. Database says, yep, I've got number 6 right here. Sends it back down to the application. And now I'm seeing the details for number 6. And this did actually happen to a major financial institution a few years ago, where you could just manipulate a value in the query string and you could see other users' accounts. So we want to think about this because, one, this is something that's fairly simple to check for, especially by our internal QA teams. Our developers should be able to look at this. We do require, though, that we have an understanding of how the application works and who should have access to what. This is one of the problems that like static and dynamic tools have, is they can't figure this out because they don't know this role or this user shouldn't have access to 5 or 6. Right? It doesn't know that. That's a business logic type of thing that really only people are figuring out. Right? So you have to be the one to look for these type of flaws. Don't rely on a tool that just scans, because we have to analyze those results. And like I said, a tool can't determine whether me as user 5 can see user 6 or not, because depending on my role, depending on lots of factors, could change whether I have access or not to those values. So we want to be cautious of that and think about, hey, when I'm pulling data, should this user have access to this? So we want to make sure we have record level authorization. And that can be done by joining on your queries, right? Hey, I'm going to take the user ID or the current session I'm in that sits in the table. Let me join that to the record table and validate that this user falls within the role that has access to these records. Could get kind of complicated, but there are ways to do this, but this is something we have to do. We have to assume that a user can manipulate whatever value we're using to identify the record that we want to get. And the most common example is sitting in the query string. Another place I see authorization issues is we try to do authorization as a security by obscurity by saying, you know what? I have a menu system for my users, and I'll display only the links that they have access to. So if I'm a regular user, I see maybe 5 links, right? I got my home, I got my blog, I've got, the edit screen for some simple stuff. But all the admin interface functions, those URLs don't come down as links for me in my menu. But if I go log in as an administrator, now all of a sudden my menu went from 5 to 10 items. And those extra 5 items are adding users, editing users, right? Things to manipulate the system that I don't want regular users to be able to do. And it makes sense. I'm not going to show those to the regular user. So I'm not saying don't do that, right? We do want to have the ability to modify the menu so that you only see the functions you have access to. The problem we run into is that oftentimes that's where we stop the authorization check, is we just say, well, I'll just show the menu items that you have access to. The problem is most times the attacker's going to find that URL of the admin user that you didn't provide to the regular user. But somehow, and trust me, it's amazing how it can get out, somehow that data is coming out. So we can't assume that just because we don't provide that link to non-admins, that link won't ever be known. Whether that's some sort of brute force tool like Dirbuster that goes through looking for common links. Oftentimes we don't get all fancy with the naming conventions, right? Even add user, it's oftentimes add user. So because we do that very commonly, it's fairly simple to try to guess some of those paths. And then people just talk, right? People see them, that the path just gets out. When the path gets out, and I've seen this in many applications I've tested where I'm a regular user, I find out the path to an admin feature, I type it in the URL, and now I have access. And the reason I have access is because the developers relied on the fact that I didn't know the URL. That was their authorization. Right? Hey, wait, you didn't have that menu item. There's no way you could have got to this screen. And that's not accurate in most cases. And when we do pen tests and when we do vulnerability assessments and we come in and we talk to companies, one of the things that we do, especially during pen tests, we always ask for multiple roles and multiple credentials. And one of the reasons for that is for authorization, right? Again, scanners have a hard time with authorization issues. People are much better at finding it. And so what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll log in as a admin user or some other higher level user, and we'll go through and we'll map the site, right? And the purpose of mapping the site is finding out just what exists within the application. How does it work? What pages exist? We want to try to hit every bit of the application we can. Then we'll switch back out, and now we'll log in as a lower level user, maybe a read-only user, maybe just a manager, a guest, a regular user, whatever your roles are set up as. We're going to go as somebody that's not an admin, and we're going to map the system. And we're going to compare those two maps and see, okay, admin had access to these 50 pages, regular user had access to 25. So I've got 25 pages I didn't see by mapping out the system as a regular user. Let me go take the URLs from the admin user that I didn't see, and let me try to go to them directly, right? I'm going to directly browse those pages, and I'm going to see if it lets me in. And in a lot of cases they do, because we were relying on the menu to hide this and not the pages to do their own authorization. So we want to make sure that all of our pages actually perform the authorization checks to validate that whoever's coming to that page has the access to do so. So we don't just allow anybody. So now, if somebody else who's not an admin discovers an admin link, when they go to it, it'll say authorization denied, right? You don't have access to this page. But if we don't do that access check on each page, then all of a sudden now we have a chance that somebody may be able to get to our page and be able to manipulate the system. And when I say each page, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single page has authorization code written into it. If you're doing something like ASP.NET where you have master pages, maybe you've got a master page for all the admin functionality or an admin section, right? And that master page does the authorization check to make sure that, hey, yeah, you're an administrator, you can access this page, right? Other technologies have other ways of doing that, where you have include files and things like that can do that. So you don't physically have to touch every single page in your site, because that can get overwhelming. But you can do it in a central location, and now you're all set, right? Kind of covers you across the board. But we really want to think about that. Another place where we'll see authentication or authorization issues is the ability to pull down files. Say you've got some PDF files or doc files, stuff like that you provide to your users. And yeah, you got to be authenticated and you have to have a certain role. But a lot of times when you pull those files, depending on how you're pulling them, they come straight from the file system. They don't come through the application. As a matter of fact, before ASP.NET 4.0, where we actually had more ability to start wrapping our .NET authentication around non.NET resources, right? A lot of times a request to a .pdf file wouldn't even go into the .NET runtime. IIS would just serve it up and there would be no authentication, right? Hey, I can go get that exe, I can go get that PDF file. And then we started having to write things to limit and say, hey, wait, we only want this user to be able to download the file. So we'll actually write it out so that we stream the file directly through PHP or ASP or JSP, whatever language we use. I'm going to pull this down. But remember, think about that when you see, if your site has files that it's providing, .pdf, .exe, .doc, .xls, any type of file like that, make sure that you have to be authenticated, you have to be authorized to view those files. Don't just assume that people can't figure out the link or that it won't come down for other people, right? So try logging out and direct browsing those links. Try logging in and logging in as a different user who shouldn't be able to see those. Validate that, yes, I have the access to be able to do this, because otherwise you're going to open yourself up to, at the very least, information leakage. And depending on what's in those documents, that could be a fairly critical flaw for your business, right? Not for all. I mean, it may just be some nonsense PDF file that probably wouldn't matter if you had protection on it or not. Or it could be something that's, very serious to your business, price sheets or other stuff that only certain users should have access to. So we really want to think about authorization. We need to start thinking about how we test authorization. If you're QA, right, you should be manipulating those values in the URLs. You should have a solid understanding of what roles exist within the system, what access those roles should have, and do like I said, right? Map out the system as both user, like an admin, each role, map it out. These are all the pages these should see. The perk to being QA is you should have documentation someplace from the requirements, from development, right? This whole process that tells you this role should have access to this field. This role should have access to this page. And if you don't, this is your chance to push for it and say, hey, look, we need to have this stuff. We need to know what roles have access to what so we can properly test it from both a functionality standpoint and a security standpoint, so that way we can better protect the company. And the good news there is if that actually works, then you're going to start getting better requirements, better design documents, all this stuff throughout the entire development process, that we'll start running into less and less of these issues because we're starting to think about them more upfront. So just because we're QA and we're sitting in the back of this whole bus doesn't mean that some of the changes that we're asking for, the stuff that we're doing, can affect the front end, which will then start making things easier for us on the back end. So map out those roles, map out these different sitemaps for each user set. If you see differences, log in as the lower user. Can I directly browse to those files or those features? That stuff is critical. Ensuring that if there's something on the URL, an ID, hey, I want to delete user 5. Well, can I delete user 6 too? Does my role allow that? And remember, be clear, your role may allow that. So, you may be a manager level and you've got 10 people you can delete out of 200. Make sure you're attempting deletion out of the 10 people you have access to. Because you can delete yours. Can I delete somebody else's? And that understanding of the application is going to help provide that, so you then know, hey, this failed or this passed. And then we can start scripting a bunch of this stuff. Right? I mean, if you're using a lot of the same test data over and over again, maybe you got scripts that have the ability to check and say, hey, log in as this user, access row 5, yep, I got access. Access row 6, wait, I shouldn't have access to this, right? So if I got access, fail. If I don't, pass. And so now our regression testing can be automated a little bit more. But again, you're required to have kind of the same database that you've been using, and that may or may not be a possibility. But we need to start thinking about different ways we can do this. And as we start doing this, we'll start seeing better security going out, and it's really not that much more of an effort. Now, if you've got a huge site and it's a huge site map, maybe it'll be a little bit, but remember, there are crawling tools out there that you can start with that'll go out and just crawl the site, they'll spider the site. And, if we give those tools credentials, well, then let's go ahead and do that. And that at least it's a step in the right direction of, I just need a quick sitemap from each different role. Let me log in and I'll crawl it with this, crawl it with this, crawl it with this. And then I can compare those crawls. And then once that starts going well, then we can start going in and manually verifying that, hey, we've hit every single page and we're not missing anything. Coverage is key when we're talking about security testing. So that's my quick rant on authorization. We'll talk about authentication at some point coming up and a whole bunch of other issues that are out there. But, just keep authorization in mind. It's critical that we have solid authorization in place because people are out there trying to break it. And we want to protect our app. We want to protect our customers. And we want to have quality systems out there. So keep up the good work. And I thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, ideas for stuff you'd like to hear me rant about, then feel free to send them to me. You can actually just send them to james@jardinesoftware.com. And I will definitely look at those and we'll see what we can do. So I appreciate you listening and have a great day. You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.